Yes.
You're talking about a kind of a racism which is an antipathy or a hostility from a person of one race, and maybe a belief in racial supremacy. What about the institutional ways, the subtle ways in which people of minority races are disadvantaged in the 21st century?
Absolutely. I even did a video on this, on how systemic racism was set up, why it was set up that way. It was set up as a way of keeping people in their places, making it seem right and true. So all of the systems had to interact together. You know, the banking system, finance system, culture, marriage system, everything had to work together. Otherwise, you would have constant discord and constant revolution by the people who were being oppressed. So both sides, the people who were advantaged by the system and the people who were disadvantaged, had to be taught it was fixed, it was inevitable, and on some level that it was right and true. So it pervaded all the laws. So as time went by and the laws, protests started, the civil rights movement came, the laws started to change. While the systems themselves would alter, sometimes the people who had been hurt by the system all this time weren't really aware of it. It's one of the reasons, if you want to look at racism in America, compare the outcomes for Black Americans versus Caribbean people who moved to the United States and Africans who moved to the United States. They moved to the United States based on the laws and the cultural norms of when they moved, not the historic system that kept Blacks marginalized and oppressed. So they have different expectations, and so they're treated differently. They'll try for different things.
And they have different outcomes, as I understand it, as well.
Absolutely, they have different
first
outcomes.
or second generation Nigerian Americans, I think, have a median wealth above the average white person, or a median income
Yes.
above the average white person, in contrast to people who are descendants of slaves.
Yes, but also too, people have to take into account culture. You also find that Blacks who live around whites do better than Blacks who live around Blacks. And the reason is that cultural norm. Often, even if I were talking about my parents, when my parents were small, my dad was born in the South during Jim Crow, when he could have been killed and nothing would have been done about it. So they grew up when racism was the law of the land. So there were a lot of things that they didn't strive for, and a lot of limitations they thought might still be there, because that's how it was in place and so firm and so dangerous to step outside the line when they were growing up. Although, to give her credit though, my mother was unusual. She came from a very well-educated family. My great-grandfather was a professor at the University of Colorado. I have a great uncle who was a Tuskegee Airman. And if your audience members want to see something really interesting, they should look that up. There was actually a film with Lawrence Fishburne from The Matrix called The Tuskegee Airmen. My great uncle was one of those guys, the first flyers, combat flyers for the United States during World War II, with absolutely the best record of protecting the bombers that they escorted of anyone. They were all lawyers, they were doctors. So even though we grew up without money, my mother had an idea that with education, you can do whatever you want. If you have a certain mindset, you can do whatever you want. And it made a huge difference. I didn't grow up with that, the white man won't let us do mindset, like many Black people grow up with.
And yet, then when you got to Stanford, you experienced all of the racism that you found at Stanford from the white professors there, which would seem to play into the current narrative that all white people are racist, even the left-wing liberal ones are racist. This is all part of a kind of racist patriarchy, essentially, and that without dismantling the structures of power, we're not going to be able to achieve justice and equity. Explain to us the difference between the forms of racism that you found at Stanford and conventional Southern Jim Crow conservative racism.
Well, the senior professors that I was having so much difficulty with at Stanford were absolute phalluses, and I'll go on record calling them that. Yes, I am. But there were also female professors and male professors in other departments and people working in the financial aid department who were white, who really went out of their way to make sure I had enough funding to keep going. And so I never saw it as they're white, so they're all out to get me. I saw it as these guys have some serious issues and someone needs to give them a swift kick in the backside. But I never generalized it. That's probably how I was able to get through. I never generalized it to everyone else. I did not hold other people responsible for their silliness.
That's interesting, because generalizing to everybody else, or at least everybody else within a certain racial or gender group, is basically the philosophy now of what you're expected to believe if you are a progressive and if you are to be considered an anti-racist and anti-sexist. So much so that, I mean, I remember, I'm sure you will have seen some of the images out of the protests after the death of George Floyd last summer in the United States. And, you know, one of them that sticks with me is an African-American police officer being shouted at by a young white girl who's accusing him of being racist. And one of his colleagues says, he can't be racist, he's black. And she starts screaming, she's foaming at the mouth, talking about how, of course you can be racist if you're black. You can be structurally racist because you're part of a system of racial oppression. Just because you don't have personal animus towards someone else doesn't mean that you're not a cog in a racist machine, and so on.